Welcome back to Supersymmetry. In the last episode, I achieved high voltage by producing HV circuits and stainless steel. Now it's time to use those resources to get to extreme voltage. The journey definitely wasn't simple, but it sure as hell was fun. So the main resource I needed for high voltage machines was stainless steel, which isn't prohibitively expensive to produce, but could become a major annoyance if not automated. So naturally my first priority was to automate it. Before I could though, I needed a room for all the machines, which I quickly constructed. Then I just needed the machines. I already had the 2 arc furnaces required for the steel, and the 3 EBFs were relatively cheap at this point of the game. And with all those parts acquired, I built up the processing setup. Now, I typically use Tech pipes and filters to transport items and fluids in setups such as these, but due to the different materials going into the same input buses, I couldn't risk one input being filled with one resource, leaving no room for any others. To resolve this potential predicament, I used XNAT, a routing mod that allows me to set limits on how much of an item it would allow in certain inventories, and to my surprise, this setup actually worked first try, so I built a nice facade and called it a day. So you've got stainless steel automated, it must be time for some HV progression. Well, not really. Due to my unfortunate lack of foresight while progressing through MV, my base was terribly suited for most automation tasks and was in dire need of renovation. Thus I spent a large amount of time building new rooms. The first room I built would be dedicated to ethylene/polyethylene production, so I stuck my fermentation vat in there and built another one to increase production capacity. Once I moved the rest of the requisite machines, I went and built a new gas turbine to power the ongoing renovations of the base. Afterward, I decided to build a large item pipeline to transport batteries to and from my oil pumps, so I didn't have to manually charge them and bring them back and forth. This saved me a lot of time. Once some of the renovations were complete, I decided it was finally time to make some progress in the HV, so I crafted my first HV motor and then proceeded to do absolutely nothing with it. Instead, I decided that a more efficient method of HV circuit production was required. This meant I needed nickel zinc ferrite, so I built a small setup for its production next to my stainless steel automation using an old reaction furnace I had lying around. Once it was obtained, I could begin making inductors, a key ingredient for better HV circuits, which I managed to obtain shortly after the inductors. With a better method of producing circuits achieved, I decided to build the HV assembling machine, which I wouldn't place for the next 70 hours of gameplay. On the renovation side of things, I decided that my silicon production was utterly inadequate for keeping up with HV demands, and rebuilt it. This time also building a mud pump as a sand supply. Using this setup, I could produce unlimited amounts of high purity silicon to go into wafer production. I also relocated my sulfuric acid production nearby, as I wanted to begin emptying the main automation hall, allowing me to reorganize it and build new machines within. While power production had kind of stopped being a problem due to oil, I still needed more throughput on some of my power grids, so using old picks obtained from my newly cut silicon, I made 2 MV 16 amp dynamo hatches, one to upgrade my medium voltage grid and the other for an eventual high voltage grid. The rest of my silicon hoard was used to craft 16 high voltage circuits, as they would help me craft the best multi-block HV has to offer. The distillation tower is a configurable multi-block that ranges in height depending on the amount of distillates it needs to output. Unlike the distillery, which voids everything but the specific chemical it is programmed to distill for, the distillation tower gives you all possible distillates for a given recipe. The only downside being their relatively high price, requiring a truckload of stainless steel and 4 HV circuits each. Regardless, those 16 circuits will be used to craft 4 distillation towers, 3 of them dedicated to processing byproducts from my quad oven, which is still a thing apparently, and the other dedicated to processing chloromethane into a variety of resources, most notably chloroform. Before building the distillation towers, however, I decided to renovate the quad oven for the 4th time this playthrough so it would be easier to channel the byproducts to the distilling area. These renovations took quite a bit, and once they were finished I built the distillation towers where the old ethylene/polyethylene production was before I moved it to its own room. With these distillation towers I could maximize the amount of byproducts I was getting from the setup. After the towers were built, I continued with some renovations in the automation hall, as the reconstruction of the quad oven caused a domino effect that required me to rebuild a lot of the piping throughout the base. I also decided to move my electrolyzer into a more accessible location during these renovations. With some more renovations out of the way, I began building my chloromethane processing plant. The production of chloroform here is important as it is the first step in producing polytetrafluoroethylene, more commonly known as Teflon and less commonly known as poly-1122-tetrafluoroethylene. Once I had the chloroform, the first step was to mix it with hydrogen fluoride to make acidic chlorodifluoromethane, which I had to put into a pyrolysis oven to make acidic tetrafluoroethylene, which would be then centrifuged with water to remove the acidity and make plain old tetrafluoroethylene. So, alright, sounds simple enough, that was like 3 steps. However, the 4th step would be a little different. In order to get tetrafluoroethylene into a state where it can be polymerized, I need to produce perfluorooctanoic acid dust, which I will be abbreviating as PFA because I honestly have no idea how to pronounce that. This stuff is the acrylic photoemulsion of HV. It was downright horrible to obtain. Thankfully, I only needed it once as the production for polytetrafluoroethylene was cyclical, but that didn't stop it from being a pain to get. First off was the production of N-octanol, which was incredibly tedious to get as it required massive amounts of ethylene, which, while I was producing, I wasn't making nearly enough to satisfy the N-octanol's demands. Even once I had obtained the requisite N-octanol, PFOA dust also required chromium sulfate and caprylic acid, which were rabbit holes in their own rights. Specifically, the chromium required the construction of a rotary kiln, which is something I hadn't even built before. Regardless, I still managed to make the PFOA dust after several hours of moving chemicals from machine to machine. With the acquisition of PFOA dust, all I needed to do was build a polymerization tank and produce the long-awaited polytetrafluoroethylene, more conveniently known as PTFE, more commonly known as Teflon, and more formally known as poly-1122-tetrafluoroethylene. After building the polytetrafluoroethylene production, I decided that my steel production was severely lacking, and decided to resolve the problem by building a device I've tentatively named the Bessemer engine. Using 2 blast furnaces clocked to HV, I could take oxygen, hydrogen, and magnetite dust and convert it to steel, completely negating the carbon requirement. This allowed me to stop using my primitive blast furnaces and make steel production an idle process. However, I ran into a slight issue. My hydrogen production was struggling, like really struggling, with keeping up with the blast furnace's demands. In order to counter this, I decided to build significantly better hydrogen production using syngas produced from my beloved quad oven. Using a HTS catalyst and a reaction furnace, I was able to turn syngas and steam into reformed syngas, which is filtered in a pressure swing absorber to make hydrogen. The next major step in progression was the clean room, a sterile environment where I could assemble advanced circuit components using EV circuits. The clean room, while mostly made of plasticrete, also required some filter blocks, which are crafted from HEPA filters. These require polypropylene, which was a chemical I did not have. But I only required a few distilleries to get its unpolymerized form, propene, from oil. I decided that if I was going to process oil, I may as well go the extra mile, and thus I was set on building a full oil distillery. The first step, as always when building distillation towers, was to accumulate as many HV circuits as possible. On top of that though, I also needed 2 oil cracking units to further refine some of the distillates, which cost 2 HV circuits each. In order to power this setup, I built an additional MV gas turbine. With the power grid established, I could begin building the processing line, which I did before tearing the entire thing down. I hadn't planned it out whatsoever, and it was kind of a big clunky mess, so I hopped into a creative world and designed a slightly more ergonomic distillery, which I built instead. After waiting a bit, the distillery yielded enough propene to be funneled into a freshly built polymerization tank, where it was converted into polypropylene. I get slightly sidetracked here, as I began putting off the construction of a clean room in favor of the production of HV superconductors. So while I do craft some plasticrete, the main block that makes up the clean room, I prioritize the crafting of HV circuits in order to make a HV mixer, chemical bath, and tube furnace. While doing this, however, I got really interrupted by large hordes of zombies, and to be honest, I just wanted to craft a piece. Seeing no other solution, I crafted a pistol and blew them all to bits. Sorry about that. Anyway, as I walked away from the pile of corpses, I ran into another problem. Hydrogen production. So you might be saying to yourself, well, I thought the hydrogen problem was solved. And it was. Temporarily, my hydrogen production had swallowed all of my syngas and was no longer running. Thankfully, there was an easy way to make more syngas. My base always was overflowing with methane, and it was often clogging up my quad oven automation. And as chance has it, methane can be converted into syngas in a reaction furnace. Thus, I installed a new reaction furnace next to the syngas reforming one and allowed for even more hydrogen production. Continuing to stall on superconductor production, I decided to build a HV turbine using the leftover MV energy hatch combined with an 8X HV battery buffer and 8 HV sodium batteries. These would later power the HV machines used to produce the superconductors. Back at superconductor production, there was yet another problem. The HV tube furnace requires a Canthal spring. Canthal is not an easy metal to obtain, as it requires pure chromium, and once blasted, it needs to be quenched in water to cool down. Thus, I halt my search for HV superconductors and put together chrome automation, something I should have done probably a little bit ago. Canthal has more uses than just springs though, and decided to make enough of it to make 16 Canthal coils, enough to upgrade my EBF. This allows it to run at a slight energy discount and makes it hot enough to smelt titanium, which will become important later. I needed 2 more ingredients for the HV superconductors: mercury, barium, calcium, copper oxide, which I'll deal with later, and liquid hydrogen. Like liquid oxygen and liquid nitrogen, it wasn't really difficult to get, but to simplify its automation I decided to dedicate a room to heat exchangers and radiators where it would be produced. Once obtained, I moved on to the production of mercury, barium, calcium, copper oxide, which wasn't so much as complicated as it was tedious. It just required a bunch of different dusts and liquids found in common ores, which I was able to swiftly acquire. Besides barium, barium sucks. With that out of the way, I can make HV superconductors. Wow! Now that I actually have HV cables that aren't trash, it's finally time to dig into HV content other than distilleries. In the classic spirit of the tech mod, the first thing I built was a HV machine hall where I placed all the machines which would have been used to obtain the superconductors. Then I went on a complete side tangent and decided to build some drills. As with the drill in the last episode, these things don't come cheap, requiring around 1,000 steel each. Thankfully, this wasn't much of a problem due to my Bessemer engine, TM. Once I had enough steel for 2 of them, I processed it into required parts and set up the drills. One of them over a metamorphic deposit for the sake of magnetite, and another over a magmatic hydrothermal deposit for ilmenite, which is basically titanium ore, but not really. Following my experience with trains last episode, I opted to use long-distance item pipes to transport the deposits to my base to be sorted. Honestly, I really like how my journey map kinda looks like a shape.io map, with different deposits connected to a processing hub. The ores being processed, it was finally time to build the clean room. And this time, I'm 100% gonna do it. After gathering all the required materials over the past few chapters, it was time to build the clean room. But not only the clean room, I'd also decided to craft every single machine needed to get the workstation at the same time to prevent any delays. It was incredibly expensive, especially on the circuit front, but it was doable. Before I knew it, I was almost fully prepared to craft my first extreme voltage circuit. The only thing missing was silane. Thankfully, it was a cheap chemical to produce, just requiring 3 MV fixed bed reactors, 3 LV distilleries, hydrogen chloride, and silicon. Once I had enough of it, it was time to make some NAND chips. Now, I don't even know what the hell was going on when they made this crafting chain, but it goes as follows. First, I roasted some typical everyday silicon wafers with oxygen to make a silicon dioxide wafer. Then I patterned it in a UV light box to get a patterned silicon dioxide wafer. After that, I etched it with hydrofluoric acid to get an etched silicon dioxide wafer. Then I doped it with high purity gallium in an ion implanter to get N-doped silicon dioxide wafers. Remember the silane? I deposit some of that onto the N-doped wafer to get a polysilicon wafer, which is then patterned, etched, doped, and covered in silane. It is then patterned in the UV light box again, bathed in nickel carbonyl to make nickel-coated wafer, which is finally patterned as a NAND chip and cut to get NAND chips. That was a lot, but thankfully there isn't too much to do in order to obtain the workstation, as it just requires 2 HV circuits, some aluminium frames, some electrum cables, and other typical circuit making stuff I had lots of. And with that, the workstation was obtained. But that isn't the end of the story, as I needed one more item before reaching EV. Titanium. Honestly, it's not that complicated, but that might have to do with the fact that I designed an automation setup in Creative before even bothering to attempt to start its production. Knowing what machines I needed, I crafted up all the circuits, machine hulls, and motors I would need. To be honest, I only hit one roadblock when prepping for building the automation. Remember polytetrafluoroethylene? Well, I needed a good bit of it for a fluidized bed reactor that would allow me to make titanium tetrachloride out of rutile dust. Sadly though, I was short 9 PTFE dusts, and as my chlorine protection had shut the bed a while ago due to some problems in my salt production, I had to take salt water that was being extracted from my oil processing and electrolyze it for chlorine, which was very time consuming. Once that bridge was crossed though, it was time to assemble one of my favorite automations yet. Processing ilmenite ore into titanium goes as follows. First, crush the ore twice and wash the result to get ilmenite dust. Then batch react it with oleum and mix the result with heated water to obtain rutile slurry, which is then sifted to get rutile dust. The rutile dust is then mixed with carbon and chlorine in a fluidized bed reactor to get gaseous titanium tetrachloride, which is cooled to a liquid, then distilled, reacted with hydrogen sulfide, and distilled again to produce titanium chloride without any impurities. A short mishap took place here though, as the next step of processing required a blast furnace running at EV, so I had to quickly scrap together 2 HV energy hatches. The main problem in obtaining them being potassium, where I used the electrolytic battery dedicated to aluminium production in order to produce. Other than a bit of alloying, I was able to make the hatches without much hassle and proceeded to blast the titanium tetrachloride with magnesium to get a crude titanium sponge, which was vacuum ejected and crushed for titanium dust. So that's it, right? Well, I needed more than just one titanium dust, and this is where the problems came from. First of all, when crushing the titanium sponge into titanium dust, there's only an 85% chance you actually get titanium. Additionally, remember how I said my chlorine production had shit the bed? Well, titanium tetrachloride needs chlorine, so I was incapable of supplying the amounts it needed. I ended up spending an hour just removing chlorine from a saltwater electrolyzer into the titanium processing line, and hoping to get the 9 titanium dust I needed from crushing sponges. During this time, I also made PVC as fast as humanly possible in between the chlorine trips, as I realized it was required for aluminium cables. It was pretty cheap though, and it ended up polymerizing it in my propene polymerization tank. Eventually though, my efforts pulled through and I tossed the titanium dust in my blast furnace. After the hot ingots were produced and had been cooled off, I bent them into plates and made my first EV machine hull, completing the HV era. The last few hours of HV were a trip. The era went pretty slowly for the first 90% of the game time, then really sped up towards the end. Like, I got the workstation and titanium within 2 days of each other. Thank you so much for watching, I really do appreciate y'all. Now, there probably won't be a mainline sussy video in a while, as the EV age isn't content complete yet, but when it is, you can bet your bottom dollar I'll be there to make a video on it. In the meantime though, I will probably put out an intermission or two, like a base tour or something. I've also been considering playing Meatball Craft.